Hello, my name is Alison Dyke and I'm going to be presenting on human and non-human worlds through the co-creation of disease. This presentation was written with my colleague Anna-Marika de Bruin from the Stockholm Environment Institute, also at the University of York, and Trish O'Flynn and Hilary Gagan, both from the University of Reading. Together, we're part of the Protect Oak Ecosystems project. To start with, I want to give you a little history, first about Greenshire Forest, the place in which our work took place, and also about the particular tree health issue that we're working on, acute oak decline. This work was funded through the Tree Health and Plant Biosecurity Initiative, and we'd like to thank our funders and also to thank the participants in our research, the forest managers of Greenshire Forest. So our starting point for this research is the context in which there are an increasing number of tree pests and diseases in the UK. And as a country where there's a relatively low percentage of tree cover, this has caused a great deal of concern about what the impacts of these pests and diseases might be, and also about how we might manage trees and forests in order to minimise those impacts. As a result, there's an increased policy need for evidence about how these pests and diseases are impacting and how they might be managed. But this is set alongside very little understanding of how forest management decisions are actually made on the ground. This is also in the context of how plant health is viewed in the UK and how it is framed. And it tends to be viewed primarily from the point of view of pathologists who see forest health and plant health as being about the relationships between pests and pathogens and hosts in the context of environments where they're found. But what happens if we consider humans in that plant health triangle? Well, certainly the role of humans in spreading pests and diseases is acknowledged, but the role that humans might have in shaping the environment in ways that will make trees or hosts more vulnerable to pests and diseases is less well understood and less acknowledged. Greenshire Forest is in the south of England and is a very ancient woodland with evidence of managements since about 500 BC. Between the 12th and the 19th centuries, it served as a royal hunting forest and woodland pasture. And during that time, the commoners of the forest held rights to grazing and to the gathering of branches through the practice of pollarding. So how pollarding works is that once a tree has reached a certain age, the branches will be cut down and used either for timber or to allow animals to graze on the leaves. And then those branches will regrow and will be cut on a cycle of about 15 years. In 1851, the rights to pollarding were transferred to the government commissioners as ownership of the forest changed, and that meant that the practice was no longer continued. So the impact that this has had is that instead of having trees with a trunk which is much older than the branches and which continues to grow old at the same rate, whereas the rate that the branches age is different and on a very short cycle, no longer happens. And what has happened is that those branches which would have been kept young by cutting have been allowed to grow and have grown very heavy, which leads to trees which can be quite top heavy and the branches may fall out and allow rot to come in. So what we can see is that the management that has happened in that forest over the last hundreds of years still plays out in terms of the tree's health today. Acute oak decline is one of many issues that the managers of Greenshire Forest are addressing, and some of those issues that they're addressing are far more pressing, such as the oak processionary moth, which has human health implications, and as such gets pushed higher up the priority list. So what do we see when we're talking about acute oak decline? Well, one of the first things we see is these bleeds on the stem, black oozy bleeds coming out of the bark. And we also see some branches which have died completely and don't have any leaves on them. We may also see branches which have yellow or brown leaves during the growing season, indicating that those branches are also dying. In terms of the scientific literature, acute oak decline is seen as a syndrome which kills trees very quickly and can do in around 6 years, which is, in the life of an oak tree, the blink of an eye, very rapid. So thinking back to that disease triangle, we have the two main species of oak which we find in the UK as hosts. We have drought or inundation of water, thought to be the main environmental context which influences the tree's vulnerability. And that vulnerability leads to bacterial infections, which are what those black bleeds that we saw on the bark are. There may be one other organism which is implicated, or which is thought to be implicated, which is the oak jewel beetle. And it's a beetle which is found in older or dying trees, but is also found in trees which have other symptoms of acute oak decline. So where does human intervention come in? Well, as we can see in the history of Greenshire Forest, the last couple of 100 years of human interventions in terms of the way that those trees are managed and the way that the ground beneath them is managed also can lead to vulnerabilities in the tree, which may mean that they are more vulnerable to infection. However, this understanding of acute oak decline is contested, and the managers of Greenshire Forest would agree with that contestation. What they see on their trees is a cyclical pattern of progression of the disease, with some trees recovering from bleeds, maybe for those bleeds to reappear in future years. And certainly they see recovery of trees as a more common occurrence than the scientific literature might suggest. So thinking about those relationships in the disease triangle, including humans, as conditions of entanglement, we can now think in a bit more detail about the entanglements between organisms, to start with focusing on non-human. So this graphic was produced using the work of another of the work packages in the Protect Oak Ecosystems project. And it shows some of the 2,000 plus species that live in association with oak. Those species live in varying levels of dependence with oak trees. And so it's very clear from this diagram that oak trees are multi-species assemblages, and it's very difficult to think of oak as a single species when there are so many species that live with them, and that oak trees themselves are dependent on for their survival, as well as those species being dependent on oak. Also, because of the close association that trees live in with each other, not just within species, but with other species too, through their fungal networks, there are also communities of entanglement through water, minerals and nutrients. And perhaps this diagram showing interspecies entanglements should also be showing things like waters and minerals and nutrients. But when we as humans think about those species and the way that they are entangled, quite often we think about them in terms of hierarchies, particularly in terms of hierarchies of virtue. That might be in terms of cultural virtue, and as one of our participants said, it goes back to John Evelyn and the wooden walls and his famous book, Silver. It's a very strong national tree, and oak is seen as being very bound up in the history of England, in the building of England, in England's naval dominance and past, and strongly connected to empire. But oak trees are also high up in a hierarchy of virtue when it comes to ecological virtue, particularly as being host to so many other species. Whereas when we think of the bacteria which are implicated in acute oak decline, they're seen as much less virtuous, partly because their role is less well understood, and so in some cases there is an assumption that their role will be negative. There are also temporal hierarchies. As oak is seen as being culturally virtuous and important in England's history, older oak trees are seen as being bound up with that history and part of that history, whereas younger oak trees are seen as having less value, and also as organisms that support less other organisms, they are also seen as being lower down the temporal hierarchy. But that's also true of other species that live in association with oak as well. Shorter-lived species are seen as being less important than those which are longer-lived. If we consider how humans are engaged with oaks through management, then that gives a slightly different slant. The management of trees is seen as domestication of trees. Domestication as a means of denying agency. This quote from Cullicott illustrates that in the concept of domesticated animals. Domesticated animals are creations of man. They are living artefacts, but artefacts nonetheless. There's something profoundly incoherent in the complaint of some animal liberationists that the natural behaviour of chickens and male calves is cruelly frustrated on factory farms. It would make almost as much sense to speak of the natural behaviour of tables and chairs. Domestication denies agency. Budis and Lawrence talk about forestry as a project of high rationalism, where there is a separation of emotion and management. But forestry does not quite conform to domestication. Trees, by outliving and outgrowing humans, are seen as not being completely domesticated, and it's difficult to completely conceptualise trees as being within our control. But the management of trees in Greenshire Forest has created organisms that are dependent on human management through pollarding for their long-term survival, and those trees with very heavy branches needs to be pollarded again if they're to survive in the same form into the future. The forest managers of Greenshire Forest describe their approach as being conservation arboriculture, so perhaps having a slightly different relationship between emotion and management than forestry. But the focus of management on organisms higher in the hierarchy doesn't necessarily advantage them, as we've seen with those trees which are now in a position where their health is endangered. What does this mean for the management of AOD? Management approaches to plant health tend to focus on eradication and control, to cutting out those elements which are seen as being problematic entirely from the system. But in the case of acute oak decline, there aren't those measures, and so in the absence of anything that might achieve that, monitoring is suggested, or perhaps removal of trees if there are only a few in an area where there are a lot of oaks. Dead trees may be removed or burned to prevent spread, and people may be prevented from accessing areas where there are diseased trees, again to prevent spread to other trees. And so, with that in mind, with the fact that there aren't any formal means for managing acute oak decline, in Greenshire Forest, the managers themselves have had to think of ways in which they can approach this and to become themselves feral. The managers of Greenshire Forest have daily interspecies relationships of care with trees and have been frustrated by what they see as science not matching with their own experience of disease. They are also hampered by their own timelines and systems. They are forced to think in a very short-term way, and so they have had to find solutions which can circumvent those things. They've gone feral with their own management, in some cases using compost teas rich in bacteria and micronutrients, which they spray into the crown of trees, and they see this as increasing the vitality of the tree and improving its ability to be resilient to disease and to recover. In doing this, they're trying to harness the tree's agency, and ferality becomes a condition of possibility for this kind of management. They're also acknowledging the entanglement of species. They're using bacteria, which are normally seen as being a negative thing, to try and improve the vitality of those trees. But they're acknowledging entanglement without seeking to understand it all. In becoming feral managers themselves, they're rejecting the emergency modality of eradication and control and seeking to find a new way of living with oak health. Thank you very much for listening. Please do get in touch if you have any questions.